Thank you for such a nice introduction, and it really is a privilege for me to be here today with all of you, so many of whom I already know, and others I'm looking forward to get to know better. My mentor, Dr. O'Hara, always says, when you're going to speak in front of a group of people, first tell them who you are and then tell them how you got there. So just briefly, I'm TracyFritz. I grew up in New England and Massachusetts, where I went to school for undergrad and for medical school at Tufts University School of Medicine. And then I did my residency in family medicine with the United States Navy down at Naval Hospital, Pensacola, where I met my husband. And after we served in the Navy together as physicians and did some overseas duties, we came back and settled in St. Louis, because that's where Barney is from. And that's who I am briefly. And how did I get here? Well, this is how I got here. That's Louisa. Barney and I had a beautiful daughter, and still do. When she was 18 months old, she had a very severe developmental regression, which continued, and she was diagnosed with autism right before her 3rd birthday. That was in April 2009, and in May 2009, I attended my first, what is now MAPS conference, where I learned from the clinicians and researchers about the neurologic, immunologic, and gastrointestinal disturbances that children with autism have, and how treating those in a clinical setting could really improve the function of those children. And that was the first time that I heard and began to learn about pandas. But it was just the beginning, because what I didn't understand then was that pandas would become even more important to me when, at age 6, Louisa had the sudden, debilitating onset of anxiety, OCD, motor and vocal tics, bedwetting, phobias, and what we believed was hallucinations when she would run into my bedroom and lock the door behind her and say, is Mardu gone? And some of you may know that Mardu is the big scary bear from Disney. So I had been learning, and I had been starting to treat patients with autism, and using a model in my primary care clinic where I would typically see 25 patients a day doing full scope family medicine. And word of mouth in the parent community travels quickly, so I started to see children with autism and work on their underlying health to try to improve their function, and then I began to see patients with pandas as well. And it was quickly apparent that I was not able to deliver this type of care that takes so much time, so much detail, so much effort, and so much communication and documentation in a clinic where I was expected to see 25 patients a day. And so Barney and I together made a decision for me to leave our very successful, very satisfying family medicine clinic that we had started together with no patients and had grown over 8 years, so that we could open up a private clinic where I could do this kind of work. And we felt led to do it, and we felt that it was important to do, and we knew that in order to do it, Barney had to stay at Mercy, which is where he is, supporting us, because as Margot mentioned, you know, it's challenging to do this work in a setting, and you do it because you want other families to not go through what you went through. And I will say that Louisa was treated by Dr. Kovesevich in Chicago, who was a godsend, and she still has many challenges. However, after her first IVIG, I think it was maybe 1 to 2 weeks, and she had complete resolution of her motor tics and has continued to improve steadily, along with a lot of other supportive treatment. And that's really what I want to talk to you all about today, because we've had such amazing information from all of the physicians and researchers that have been here. And I think what I'd like to add is my perspective in terms of what we call integrative or functional medicine, which is really just trying to look at all of the pieces for an individual in their body and in their family and their community, everything that affects a patient, and to try to address those things to facilitate healing on whatever protocol they're on. I'm just going to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. the concept of homeostasis, which is balance versus imbalance, and then basic foundations that I think are important for all of us, our children especially when they're sick and they need to heal, of sleep, stress, and nutrition. And then I'm going to go through the body system foundation, which I mentioned earlier when I talked about what I began to learn in my autism conferences, which is the neurologic system, the immune system, and then the gastrointestinal system, which I will call the gut from now on. And then, if I have time, I want to talk about the cellular foundation, which is really how the body runs in a very tiny way, but a very powerful way. And then just talk about homeostasis again. So now, I didn't mention I was an English major, and I'm kind of a word nerd. So I love definitions, but I also think definitions are important because then we can all understand what we're talking about. So I'm going to read you the definition. I know you all can read the slide, but homeostasis is the tendency of an organism or a cell to regulate its internal conditions, usually by a system of feedback controls so as to stabilize health and functioning regardless of the outside condition. And so the concepts that I want you to think about as I start to talk about what I recommend patients to do is that the body is designed to heal. You know, you can cut yourself in the kitchen with a knife and you have no doubt that that cut will heal, but a lot of complicated things have to happen to make that happen. We take it for granted. And so all the time our body's responding to what's happening in the environment. We have stress, we respond to it, our body adapts, we're balanced again, and we're healthy. If you get a response and your body can't respond to it in an appropriate way, things become imbalanced, and that's what we consider disease. And so disease is defined as the inability to return to a state of homeostasis. As I said earlier, the body has mechanisms to restore balance, but sometimes the illness itself disrupts that. And if it's an immune system disorder, then it certainly can be very tricky to get the body and the immune system working like it's supposed to again. So the interventions that I'm talking about are aimed at trying to support the body's ability to do that. And I'll say before I move on, I mean, when I treat patients, I do the workups that were talked about here, you know, the complete serologic workups. I also do some additional things I'll talk about, and then whatever the appropriate treatment is for that child. You know, I'm able to do IVIG if that's an indicated therapy for the patient, but this is also, in my mind, an extremely important part of the treatment plans that I do for patients. And I'll also add that, you know, I don't do research in my clinic, I mean, other than an N of 1, which is I rely on the education that I get at conferences, on the papers that I read that are published by the fabulous physicians here, but I learn the most from my patients. I'm a clinician, and we practice medicine. And I hope that what I can share with you today will empower you to leave here feeling like there's things you can do in your home for your children's health, and hopefully that's the result of what I've learned by taking care of patients who have PANS and PANDAS. So basic foundation, sleep. I'm going to torture you with definitions. Okay, everybody knows what sleep is. We all sleep, but I just want to talk about really what happens when you sleep, okay? It's the natural periodic suspension of consciousness during which powers of the body are restored, right? So you sleep, you need your rest. It's characterized by changes in our brainwave activity, our breathing, our heart rate, and, you know, other physiological functions. I guess, you know, we all know that. But there's certain things that your body does when you're sleeping that are associated with digestion, with the ability of your cells to repair, with growth, and with immune modulation. So we heard already how important sleep is. And I'm going to talk about the things we can do to make sure that our kids are sleeping when they're trying to heal. So obviously you have to sleep to heal. Sometimes the sleep problem is the result of the illness, and so you have to address those sleep problems. But then as you improve and heal from the illness, normal sleep is restored and you may not need all the supports anymore. We talk about a concept called sleep hygiene, which is basically just make an environment that facilitates sleep. For the children, try to have a routine, make things quiet, calm, dim lighting, minimize electronics. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about the iPad and Minecraft and all the things that we know our kids need. But when you're gearing up for sleep, you do want to minimize the electronics because that visual stimulation really works against what we're trying to accomplish with sleep. One of the things I love and usually encourage my patients to do is if the child's willing to put them in a bath with 1 or 2 cups of Epsom salt. That's magnesium sulfate salt. It relaxes muscle, both smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, so kind of your automatic muscles you don't think about, like your digestion, but also your muscles that you've been moving all day. And our kids carry around a lot of tension. They have a very high sympathetic tone, you know, that fight or flight response is on. And sometimes in a Epsom salt bath for 15 or 20 minutes, it can really help reset that switch from the sympathetic tone to what we call the parasympathetic tone, or just relaxation. You know, if you're in fight or flight, you can't be relaxed. It's one or the other. And so we always are trying to trick their body to going into that relaxed mode. Another thing I really like to use, and I find, you know, very effective in my clinic, is essential oils. And, you know, I'll say this now, and I think oils seem relatively benign, and I believe that they are. But sometimes when you're practicing clinical medicine, you always want to use what we call the precautionary principle, which is above all, do no harm. You know, do not leave your patient in worse shape than when they met you. But if you know that something is safe, and you know that it may have a benefit in some individuals, I think that it's worth trying. And a lot of the things I'm talking about are like that today. So, and you know, essential oils have been used for thousands of years. So you can, if your child will let you, you can give them a massage. Certain oils are very relaxing, like lavender, chamomile, ylang. And I put a few resources on these slides, which this presentation will be available on my website as a PDF tomorrow in case you want links. And this, I'm not endorsing any one product over the other, but you know, people tell you to do things and then you don't know how to put it into practice. So Young Living is a nice manufacturer of very nice quality oils, and I like their page because they have a lot of education. So, okay, you can try those nice natural remedies to try to facilitate sleep. And, you know, please understand that for 3.5 years, Louisa stayed up till midnight and woke up between 3:30 and 5 a.m. while I was working full time. So I know the value of sleep, and I know that, you know, it's hard sometimes when the child has so much immunological and neurologic disruption to get them to sleep, but these are things that we can continue to try until we can restore their normal sleep cycle. So over-the-counter medicines, and of course I would hope that you would do this in consultation with your own physician. But usually these are best given about 20 or 30 minutes before the child is going to go to sleep. Melatonin, we've seen other doctors talk about it, but that's a naturally occurring brain hormone that puts you to sleep. The dose we usually use in kids is between 3 and 6 milligrams, and in my experience, if 5 or 6 milligrams doesn't work, then 10 isn't probably going to work either. So I usually start with 3 and find that if melatonin is going to be effective for somebody, that's pretty much the dose that works. If it's a bigger child, then I'll try 6 sometimes. Ibuprofen, we've heard about this as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. It really does help a lot of individuals who are having PAN symptoms, but it also has a side effect of sedation, of making you sleepy. You know, in the Navy, we had to give pilots a down chit, and meant they couldn't fly if they were taking ibuprofen because it is sedating. So we want to take advantage of that side effect in our children. I like to use a liquid medicine, even in kids who can swallow pills, because the onset of action is a little quicker, and of course I always recommend a dye-free formulation. And then Benadryl, not for extended use for sleep per se, but it can be really helpful when a child's having a sleep disturbance. Especially, I find an increased effect when you mix the Benadryl with the ibuprofen. And then if the over-the-counter medicines and the natural remedies aren't working, sometimes we move to prescription medications. Atarax is really one of my favorite medicines in PANS because it's very similar to Benadryl. It's an antihistamine. It is prescription, though. You need a prescription from your physician. It has a more potent anti-anxiety effect than Benadryl does, and a slightly more sedative effect, so it's really good to use at bedtime. Another trick I learned, which I've found to be helpful with my patients, is if they have a lot of anxiety, if the child does, about a procedure or a blood draw, you can give a dose of ibuprofen combined with Atarax, and it can just bring their stress level way down, where they can be successful at doing something that perhaps before would take 4 or 5 people to hold them down for a blood draw. And I think because it's relatively safe, it's worth a try. Another prescription medicine we use frequently is clonidine, which is an alpha blocker. It's an old medicine, was a blood pressure medicine originally, and it's been used in pediatrics for a long time. And if a child's on a stimulant, you know, needed for ADHD symptoms, that can sometimes interfere with sleep as well, and clonidine's a nice medicine that's usually well tolerated. This has been mentioned already a few times, but if a child is having problems during sleep that you think might be related to sleep apnea, which would be maybe they have these big, huge tonsils or adenoids, they're snoring, they're breathing through their mouths when they're sleeping, or if they are having fitful sleep, kind of acting out their dreams, they may have that REM sleep behavior disorder, and that is amenable to treatment with melatonin sometimes, and sometimes a very low dose sleep medicine, a benzodiazepine. But I think that that's important to ask your physician for a referral for a sleep study if you see those issues with your child. The other thing that I check a lot is a ferritin level, which is an iron level. I'll get to it in a little bit, but our children often don't have very good absorption of their nutrients because their guts aren't in great shape. And if you have a low ferritin level, that's one of your iron stores, that'll give you restless leg syndrome. And sometimes an iron supplement can change the sleep pattern. And so that's an easy thing to do, and I think every child deserves a ferritin level if they're having trouble sleeping. And then, as I said, I try to look at gut issues to try to help with sleep issues. Okay, stress. So I don't have to tell any of you really about stress, but physiological stress is defined as any external or internal condition that challenges the homeostasis of a cell or organism. All right. So stress can make the immune system further dysregulated, and decreasing the stress can improve regulation of the immune system. All right. And so what kind of things can relieve stress? Well, movement, exercise is really good. I mean, when our kids are well enough, we really want to encourage them to walk, swim, jump, bike ride, if they do sports and they enjoy them, whether it's with individual or by themselves, to try to encourage that kind of movement. And then emotional stress, I talked a little bit about that sympathetic, parasympathetic mode, that fight or flight versus being relaxed. Recreation helps with that. And there's also techniques of deep breathing. I mean, that is one of our little physiological tricks. If you're in that fight or flight mode, deep breathing on a count of 8, repeated a few times, actually changes your nervous system so that you are almost forced to go into the relaxation mode. But what's funny is, when you're in that stress mode, you don't really want to deep breathe. You're going to do that later. Just let me do this first. But it's something that you can teach the kids if they feel like it's coming on to take their breaths. And I laugh sometimes when Louisa gets upset and then before I can even say anything, looks at me and says, I don't want to take 3 deep breaths. And so you can teach the kids some yoga techniques, which are very effective because that's breathing and movement combined together. And if there's something that they like that will help them relax, then try to do it with them if you can, even if it's watching Dora for the 800th time. Okay. And I think this is an important concept that I wanted to share. Events that seem like fun or low stress for us may be extremely stressful for our children, and it actually may trigger negative behaviors in them. One of the big sources of stress in our kids is sensory overload. And I think it's a hard thing to really understand if you haven't experienced it to some degree. And remember that when our children are affected by these symptoms, their ability to communicate with us what they're actually experiencing is really impaired. And I know that many of the parents in the audience have learned that as their child improves, and then they communicate, oh yeah, I was seeing this, or I felt this way, or oh yeah, I could hear the bird flapping its wings outside my window. Well, you can imagine when somebody's talking right at their face, they might be overwhelmed easily. So sometimes it seems like a mystery why the behavior will suddenly change. But sometimes if you're a good detective, you can look and figure out that actually it was a sensory disturbance that started it. So this is a story, and this is about a young woman who she had autism, and this was a while ago, so I'm not really sure. Who knows exactly what had caused it for her? But in any event, she recovered to full function. But she had severe sensory distortion when she was little, and as she improved, there was a big thunderstorm, and she went out in the rain at like 10:30 at night, and her parents said, Georgia, why are you out in the front yard spinning around in the rain at 10:30 at night? And she answered, because the rain doesn't sound like machine guns anymore. And so what I really think is fascinating about this story is, can you imagine if rain outside sounds like machine guns? You're really not going to want to go outside. And this fascinating young woman had been institutionalized for a while for treatment, And one of her really problematic behaviors was when that it rained, she would try to fling herself out the window. And of course, she was restrained, and it was really traumatic for her. And what she communicated later when she was fully verbal and able to talk about her experience was that she had been paying attention in class and had learned about monsoons. And when she heard the rain to this level that it was to her, she thought there was a monsoon and she was trying to get herself to safety. And this really gives me pause, because when you look at some of the behaviors that our children engage in, and obviously I'm not talking about OCD-driven behaviors, but sometimes it seems bizarre or nonsensical, but actually for the child, sometimes it's a very intelligent, thoughtful response to what they're experiencing. Like, just briefly, as Louisa was improving with her autism symptoms and being much more communicative and able to, interact and go places with me, when we had been to the grocery store, I think maybe one time successfully, which was a big deal because grocery stores were off limits. And so I pulled up in the minivan. This was at our local Schnucks, and I wasn't aware it had recently rained. And so I opened up the door, and I went to get her, to pull her out of the minivan and go, and she had an absolute breakdown. And very, very resistant, just a complete breakdown. And so I put her back in the van. I was still standing outside, and I didn't look at her, because it can be overwhelming when a child's in an episode like that. I just whispered kind of quietly in her ear, "What's wrong?" And she said to me, "It's too loud." And I had to look around, and I realized that because of the recent rain, the ground was wet. Everybody was pushing their shopping carts, and it was so loud. The tires from the cars going on the wet pavement was extra loud. And there was a bagger who had, 20 carts, and he was pushing it toward the door. And as I stopped to appreciate the sound, it was overwhelming. And at that point, I was able to say to her, "It's okay, it's loud, it's because of the rain, I understand." And she, thank goodness, has been blessed with a great sense of humor. So I did something to make her laugh, and I said, "Let's try to run as fast as we can." And I actually carried her and kind of did just my best, comedy routine as we ran in, and kept reassuring her that once we got inside, it would be quiet. And it was, and she made it successfully inside. And she's never had that issue with going into the grocery store since. But I look back and realized that that was a huge issue for her, the sensory overload in the parking lot, which to me was something I couldn't even conceive of. And so I talk to parents sometimes, and they're frustrated because they're trying to do nice things for their children. They want the family to go on a walk, or they want to go, on a nature walk through the woods. But if the child is smelling the dirt and it's absolutely repugnant to them and makes them feel like they're going to vomit, they might not want to go on the nature walk with you, but they can't necessarily communicate that to you. So we really do have to be detectives, and just remember to look at the sensory world. And I usually encourage people to watch a sensory overload video just to get an idea. Police have to go through this training so that they can understand if somebody has sensory problems, how to deal with them. And I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try. But I will say that, forgive me in advance, if you do have sensory overload problems, you might want to step out just during this 1-minute video, which is designed to try to give people like us who don't have sensory disturbance an understanding of what our children are experiencing. Oh, I got it, thanks. I think I've got it. All right, look. Oh, yeah. But I keep doing it because, sorry, I want to start at 50 instead of at the beginning. Oh, gotcha. All right. 50. That'd be perfect. Great. All right. It has to be loud to work. This is Walmart. I think I'm going to skip that because it's not really playing like it's supposed to, but the link is on the presentation. And if you have a chance and you have some headphones or good speakers, I would really encourage you to watch. And there's lots of them available on the internet. And I think that then it might change the way you look at things in your child's world. So basically, you really want to work on stress management. You want to be aware that sensory changes can trigger emotional stress, but that also changing the sensory environment can decrease an emotional response. And I mentioned earlier iPads, Minecraft. I mean, obviously, as parents, you know, we're trying to be good, and we you know, they tell us don't let them do more than an hour, 2 hours max a day on TV or video. But you know, our kids are in such a bad way. And I've had many patients tell me the only time I feel normal is when I'm playing Minecraft, you know, or the only way that I feel calm is if I'm watching the iPad. So I think that, you know, you know, this has to be in balance with you know, keeping the symptoms confined. But I think that, you know, you can let yourself off the hook a little bit if you're trying to follow the normal guidelines. We're not in a normal situation. So make it very individualized for your child. And you need to allow yourself opportunities to relieve physical and emotional stress. And you know, I know that this is hard. This is difficult to do. But if we're the ones taking care of our children, we have to take care of ourselves. And I also understand that, you know, sometimes I'll tell a parent, you know, you should take a Epsom salt bath too and put some lavender oil in it. And they look at me like, you know, I'm crazy. Because, you know, there were times where Barney and I couldn't have a conversation with each other because Louisa perceived it as screaming, or a time when I just couldn't speak with him at all because she couldn't tolerate me talking to anybody else, you know, or I couldn't, you know, leave the house because she was so afraid. But and so during those times, you have to do the best you can. But those probably aren't the times you should be on the internet till 2:30 in the morning, trying to learn more. You know, rest when you can, and even when you're in these crazy circumstances, you know, maybe try to find something that you can have a laugh about or a smile about. Because even when our kids are so sick, they're still who they are to me. So she always makes me laugh. Okay, nutrition, and this is a big issue, you know, a big concern of mine. So of course, nutrition is taking in food, right? Taking in food and using it for growth, metabolism, and repair, and that's what we need to do when we're healing. And the concepts are that in order for your body to work, you need nutrition, and nutrition requires food, and it also requires a healthy, functioning gut. And there's a big concept for me, which is what is real food versus artificial food? Real food, as it's defined, is carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, as well as minerals and vitamins that are taken in and used by the living body for growth and repair and as a source for energy. And you know, a lot of our kids don't have good energy. So we need to feed our children real food, and we need to eat real food. And I think in our times now where we're all under so much pressure and we all work so hard, we don't have time. A lot of times both parents are working outside of the home, and meal preparation is not what it used to be. And where we get convenience in many ways, we have to be aware that we're giving up something, and that's actual nutrient value in food. And when you're sick, your body needs nutrients, so you need real food. Okay, so what is real food? Vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, legumes, grains, fats, oils, animal protein, and animal milk. And I personally think that organic matters. Now, it's expensive, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can kind of pick and choose where you're going to spend your organic dollar, because some foods it's more important than others. But we don't know what a lot of these novel chemicals, new chemicals made over the last 20 years, I think the last toxicology conference I was at, it was 150,000 novel chemicals, not regulated, not studied. We don't know how these affect us, and they're in so many of our foods and in products that we use, that if you're trying to minimize the stress that your immune system's experiencing, then you don't want to introduce things that don't naturally occur when you have a good alternative. In fact, a better alternative, which would be what Mother Nature made for us to eat. When you're shopping, an organic product will start with a 9, and one that isn't organic starts with a 4. That's an easy way to look. And I already talked, I'm going to go a little faster through some of these slides because I want to be able to get through the whole talk. But basically, just be aware of artificial ingredients. And when you can, try to choose something that actually occurred naturally. It's going to be a lot easier for the body to get the good nutrients it needs from it. So this is from the Environmental Working Group, and they call the dirty dozen, which are the 12 foods that are highest in pesticides, and then the clean 15, which are lowest. So, if you're going to buy organic, you'd probably be better to get organic strawberries, but you don't have to necessarily get an organic avocado since it's so low in pesticides. So general recommendations for nutrition are to eat a variety of real foods, choose organic when you can, avoid artificial ingredients, and avoid sugar. And so I always like this quote, let food be thy medicine and let medicine be thy food. Now, of course, if I have group A strep, I want my antibiotic, but I think that nutrition is the foundation. So now I'm going to talk briefly about the body systems. And we know that in PANS, we have disruption of the neurologic system. That's usually the symptomatology that brings the children, in to be evaluated and treated. And it's immunological, because it's an autoimmune or a misdirected immune response. And then the other body system that I was so happy to hear Dr. Cooperstock talk about was the gastrointestinal, or the gut system. So, and I think this is an important concept for parents and for practitioners. The neurologic system does not work in isolation. The immune system doesn't work in isolation. They're both part of that intricate feedback system with the gut and with the gut microbiome I'll get to in a minute. So I think that addressing all three of these symptoms can really help our kids improve and heal. And so this is a slide I like, which is very similar to the one Dr. Cooperstock had, except for patients who know me, you can see in the middle, there's the microbiota, one of my areas of questioning all the time. I need to know what's happening in the body. And so you can just see there's connections. They're all interconnected. And in the middle is the microbiota. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And this is just briefly to give you an overview. I know you've heard so much detailed information, but this is kind of just a foundation. At least that's what I'm trying for. So the immune system, it's a highly complex system. It turns on via a cascade system. That means you turn one switch on, and that turns on 2 switches, and then 4, or maybe 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and before you know it, you're at 1,000,000. So when you turn it on, it works that way because it has to defend us, and you want it, responding right away. But when it's a misdirected response and it happens and turns on all over the place, it can be really difficult to deal with. It turns off via a feedback system, and as Dr. Cunningham talked about earlier, sometimes that feedback system gets disrupted as part of the illness, and that's really the challenge at trying to get the immune system to return to a normal function. So when I think about the immune system, and when I learned all about the immune system, the first thing the immune system has to figure out, because it defends us against the environment, if you will, what is self and what is non-self. And when that's mixed up, you have autoimmunity. It also has to determine in the environment what's dangerous and what isn't dangerous. If the immune system identifies something as dangerous that isn't, like pollen or peanuts or dog dander, then you have allergies. And then you have to have the immune system be regulated, and if that gets disrupted, then you have what we refer to as chronic inflammation. So, and Dr. Cunningham touched on this during the Q&A, but you have multiple lines of attack, and so and the regulatory cells are called, or molecules are called cytokines, and we know that in our kids this system gets very, very disrupted. And I'm mentioning these briefly because later when I tell you about some of the testing I do, I want you to understand that we look at different antibodies for different things. So antibodies are one part of the immune system. I think of it as like a military force. And you've got, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Navy. Go Navy. And so we have IgA, IgM, IgG, and IgE. And I just listed there that they work in different places. And largely the IgA is in your mucous membranes, which is from the tip of your nose to the end of your GI tract. You don't think of it, I never used to think of it this way, but that's the part of your body that's in contact with the outside world. And so it's important that it's defended, especially. And then IgM, usually for new infections, IgG, which is what we measure a lot in our kids. And then IgE, you see often in allergy and in parasitic infection. So this we already talked about. Just one of the, I guess, revisited discoveries on the immune system, that the lymphatics go right up into the brain. But I think that this is important, and I included it because it's exciting, and I think it's going to offer a research opportunity for mechanisms for autoimmune disorders that cause neurologic function. But also, they have to change all the medical textbooks because based on centuries of dissection, we understood that the lymphatics didn't go into the brain, and yet we just discovered that they do. And I think that that should make all of us remember that even when we think we understand something, we might not fully, and so we all have to have an open mind and help educate one another. Okay, the gut. This is where all that nutrition, ingestion, digestion, absorption, transport, assimilation, and excretion all happen. And some people call the gut the second brain, and for reasons Dr. Cooperstock mentioned earlier. So when the gut's not working right, you can have appetite disturbances, weight loss, weight gain, mood changes, and it's where the microbiome lives. And the microbiome is the ecological community of commensal, symbiotic, and pathogenic microorganisms that literally share our body space. And I think this is an important concept too, or at least one that I try to bear in mind during practice. Commensal means it lives there and it doesn't hurt you, but it might not really be helping you. Symbiotic means it benefits and you benefit. And then pathogenic means it's causing a disease. But we know this for lots of other reasons in the body when it comes to organisms. A commensal organism, if it overgrows, like a vaginal yeast infection, for example, it causes disease. And so when your microbiome gets disrupted, even organisms that normally are there not causing a problem can then start to cause a problem. And that's why I think it's important to look there. And again, Dr. Cooperstock mentioned some of this, but I mean, just to put it in perspective, a healthy adult gut has about 3 pounds of microbiota in it. It has a major impact on our health, but our choices have a major impact on its health. So it's something that we can help. And when it gets out of balance, then you have an imbalance of the microbiota. One term that people use sometimes is dysbiosis. And when the gut is off and the microbiota is imbalanced, some of the things that you can see are actual metabolites that come from the organisms. Clostridia, for instance, is one of them, that can release a chemical, an acid actually, that can really be toxic to neurologic function. And in a mouse model, they've taken this and injected it into mice and really disrupted their behavior. And it can interfere with your neurotransmitter production because, the chemicals that help our brain work, our dopamine and everything, a lot of them are manufactured in the intestine. And when your gut's off and your microbiota is off, you can have hyperactivity, sensory and mood problems just from the gut disturbances. You also can have allergies and sensitivities. And if you have an inflamed gut, sometimes you experience skin rashes, joint pain, and fatigue. So, and obviously our kids sometimes have abdominal symptoms. So this is just an image that kind of recaps what I said, but it's a very important system. And so it's one of the places that I look. And actually, to talk about the foundation, when I first, people come in and they're having neurologic and immunological problems and a lot of behavior problems, and I start asking them about, their poop and how often they do, and they're just like, where are you going with this? Well, I feel, the foundations for healing, the first thing you have to do is get that microbiota and get that gut function, that second brain, as healthy as you possibly can. And a reason that I look here is this is something that we can accomplish. The gut, the first 3 steps. And then the first 3 steps to healing the gut is real food, real food, real food. And I already talked about the recommendations. One of the things about avoiding sugar, though, is that sugar has low nutritional value. I mean, it's a celebratory food. I'm not anti-sugar. It's to be enjoyed in small amounts. It has very limited nutritional value. You're not going to get nutrients and vitamins and minerals that you need when you eat sugar. It's inflammatory to the immune system. And I try to remind my patients that microorganisms, they use sugar for fuel. We can use sugar and fat and protein. So we want to feed our body nutrients that fuel us and don't overfeed our microbiome. Some of the things I look at is, when I'm looking at the gut, is food sensitivity. And it's different from a food allergy. I measure the IgG in some patients where food allergy is IgE, but I do that testing as well. And it's different from celiac, which is a gluten allergy, but it's the IgA antibody. And so the test that I do can tell me a lot about the health of the gut. I'll tell you in PANS, and a lot of this work I started to learn about in taking care of my children with autism, but I'll tell you I see very, very similar findings in our kids with PANS, and they're both really neuroimmunological disorders. So it's not surprising, but gluten, casein, and soy are often foods that children are sensitive to. And I often see findings that tell me that the gut lining is not working like it's supposed to. I also do stool testing, which looks at digestion, absorption, inflammation. It looks at the intestinal microbiome. And I see over and over again in our kids that they have findings that show that they're not having proper digestion, which, and Dr. Cooperstock hit on this earlier, but some of what our microbiota does is their presence is necessary to make the enzymes that we need to digest our food. So if we don't have the right complement of the bacteria that's supposed to do that, we're not going to make enzymes for us to properly digest our food. And then this undigested food sits around, and then who gets to feast on it? The bacteria. And so then the imbalance gets even more profound. And then often I will see bacterial infections, that, certain bacteria is expected in the stool, but certain bacteria isn't. And so there's certain germs I'll see that are growing and need to be treated. And again, fungus is allowed in the intestinal tract. It belongs in the intestinal tract just like it does in the vaginal tract. But if it overgrows and you don't have presence of the normal healthy bacteria that should be there, then that needs to be addressed and treated, and I do that. So what we think about when we're trying to heal the gut, the 4 R's: you remove, you repair, you restore, and you replace. So I ask the patient to remove food allergens. Now, I know that at least 50% of our kids have real problems with feeding, and I will repeat that we have to make sure that they eat. So there may be individuals that this isn't going to work right off the bat for, but it is a goal. But you want to remove food allergens. Often it's temporary, just for a period of time, and until you can get the gut to heal. And I've seen this time and again in both my in many of my patients, adults included. When we remove a food that the person is sensitive to, not what we would think of as a true IgE allergy, but they're sensitive to, within 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes 10 or 12. I have had patients where their asthma goes away completely. They're off of all of their inhalers, all of their inhaled steroids. Their eczema goes away. So you know that food is affecting the immune system in some way, and when that food goes away, the immune system symptoms go away. And I already talked about trying to eat a clean diet that's as free of chemicals as you can get, and then to appropriately treat appropriately diagnosed infections. And then repair. So the clean diet, and then I usually use essential fatty acids, antioxidants like vitamin A, C, and E, anti-inflammatories. And it's interesting because, these are herbal or food, if you will, but they do have some research behind them and some nice studies, mostly from Europe because they use them a lot more and study them a lot more. But curcumin, it was mentioned yesterday. Curcumin is one of my favorites, and actually it was pretty widely studied in the oncology world because they discovered a while ago that it was a very potent immune modulator. And what I like about this is it's really safe, but it's really effective. And then quercetin, and these are just some products that I use just for your reference, but aloe vera, L-glutamine, and zinc and magnesium. And of course, this would be based on an individual's testing. Then you want to restore the beneficial bacteria. So you want to do that on a daily basis. And especially for our kids, and Dr. Murphy talked about this, but a lot of our children who have to be on long-term antibiotics, you do want to reintroduce healthy bacteria to try to ensure that you're keeping a balanced microbiome. And so she mentioned Florastor, which is Saccharomyces boulardii, which is one that I really like, and that has been shown to prevent C. diff and to help in healing from C. diff. 2 strains, that's a friendly yeast, by the way. 2 strains that I like to use are Lactobacilli and Bifidobacterium. And then you want to make sure that it's an adequate dose. And then in pans, I usually do start low and slow with the probiotic because I find that even the introduction of healthy bacteria can kind of tweak the immune system a little bit, but it's only a couple of weeks before you can get them up to a dose that seems appropriate and it's well tolerated. One of my favorite things to recommend, though, for keeping a healthy gut is to actually use fermented foods. And fermented foods are, foods that have naturally occurring bacteria in them. And people have done this for a long time. And it really, every culture has some form of fermented foods, but I think in our modern world, we've kind of gotten away from them. You can buy cod liver oil that's fermented and actually tastes pretty good. Sauerkraut juice, kefir, which Dr. Murphy mentioned a recent paper, yogurt, beet kvass, miso. And there's a great book that I noted there by Sally Fallon with a lot of great recipes for this and for just real food. I replace digestive enzymes at the beginning of treatment. I mean, the goal is that you're going to fix the gut so that, and have the right complement of bacteria so that they're doing it on their own. But in the meantime, I find the enzymes very helpful. And then you want to make sure that you're giving minerals, and those are pretty easy to do. And then immune system healing. I like to look for allergies, and I think most docs do. You know, if you already know you have a child whose immune system is under complete stress, if they also have allergy in the environment and you can control it, then you want to try to do that. So if a child hasn't been tested for environmental and food allergies, I usually do that as part of the first visit, because I think of it as any way, you know, we can't control what happened with the strep. We can't control the misdirected immune response that happened from that infection, but I think that we should try to control the things that we can control. And so if we identify allergies, we can take those allergen foods out, and we can try to manage the environment so that the child's getting the least immune activation from environmental allergens. I also test for other autoimmune problems, celiac, thyroid. I don't see tons of it, but I do see some autoimmune thyroid disease, and CFD, which is an antibody that can be formed against the folate receptor that brings folate into the brain. That's more something that I look at in my children with autism, but I've tested a few really severe children with PNs and found that present too. And the reason I do that is it's treatable. You just give appropriate doses of folic acid, which is B9, and they can have a nice clinical improvement. And I look at inflammation markers. And so you'll start to see, as I talk about the interventions, that they're similar. A clean diet, address the gut, but then treat the allergies. And I see a lot of kids, we do use allergy medicines sometimes for immune modulation in pandas, but I see some kids who just have rhinitis, and they've got immune, those blue shiners under their eyes. And they need Flonase, and they need, daily Zyrtec. We need to treat their environmental allergens, because that's just an additional stressor, as I mentioned, on their immune system. Some things you can avoid, maybe like a dog, but you're not going to avoid trees, so you need to be treated, in my opinion. And there's things you can do in the home, like HEPA filters and dust filters, and these special new filters that use an ionic technology and really can get rid of mold and other things. I think they're a good investment, because your child spends a lot of time in the house. And we already talked today in the Q&A about allergy shots. If you're able to do desensitization therapy and it can help, that I think it's worth doing. This is just a quick graph, and I want to make sure I have enough time, so I'm not sure I'll get into that too much. But basically, that graph shows a regression in symptoms with ADHD or autism is one of the lines, and the other line is pollen. So I think that and a lot of kids, it's spring and now he's flaring, and so if we can preempt that and treat the allergies, I think we're doing them a favor. Again, we already talked about ibuprofen and antihistamines, and it's the recurring theme for me. A lot of the things that Mother Nature makes does more than one thing and helps all around. And then a really favorite of mine for an anti-inflammatory effect is bone broth, and I put a link there so you can see if you want to buy it. It's easy to make and easy to get a recipe. You have to make it taste good to get it in the kids, or hide it in their food, which is more likely the way that we do it. And if you do identify an autoimmune disorder, you obviously would treat it. And then I already said, we're trying to get the immune system to calm down. I always like for people to try to go to the Environmental Working Group webpage and look at the products that they're using in their home. And it's overwhelming at first. You're just trying to deal with getting through the day, and I understand that. But there's chemicals that may be in the house, and you don't realize it's just habit or advertising, brand loyalty, what you're used to, that may be further stressing your child's immune system. And it's not that you have to go and change everything at once, but maybe the next time you go to buy cleaner for the counter, you could pick one that was less chemical. My grandmother cleaned everything with vinegar, lemon juice and bleach for tough jobs. And I think that that was probably wiser than what we're doing now. And the other thing I just want to talk about is pesticides. Again, we don't know the full effect of pesticides on humans, but and I know they're here, and I don't think they'll mind me sharing, but recently I had a patient just a couple of weeks ago, and they had an insect problem that needed to be addressed in their home. They had somebody come to spray, and within hours, their child was having a very dramatic flare of his ticks, and he had been virtually tick-free prior to this. I think the spray was at 8:30 or 9, and by 10:30 he was ticking like crazy. Now, we were able to get right on top of it with some anti-inflammatory therapy, and within a week he was 90% better. But I think that that is a good example of stressing out the immune system in a way that's completely preventable. And I felt badly that I hadn't told them before to try to avoid pesticides. And if it does have to happen, just have the child out of the house, do it on a Friday, see if they can stay with grandma overnight, or something like that. But just to be mindful of it. I think that we're awash in chemicals that we take for granted. We put them on our skin, they're incorporated into our foods, we spray them around, and I think that if we just stop for a minute, we can really make our environment less stressful for our immune system. And then, neurologic, treat the gut, treat the immune system. I was excited to hear Dr. Cooperstock talk about vitamin D too, which he already talked about, but it's an easy thing to fix, it's an easy thing to identify, and in my clinical practice, 100% of my children with autism have a low vitamin D. I haven't measured one yet that was normal, but in my kids with PANS, and I measure it on everybody, I'd say probably 60 to 70% have an actual low vitamin D, a vitamin D deficiency as defined by the Vitamin D Council, but I'd say 100% of them are suboptimal. So the goal, especially with developmental or neurological issues, would like to have them over 60 if possible. And of course, you need sun to get vitamin D to activate and work properly, and sometimes our kids don't want to go outside because of how they're feeling. And also, it's a fat-soluble vitamin. Your gut has to be working to get it in. So I'll usually supplement that and then use a maintenance dose and monitor it at the beginning every 3 to 6 months and then annually. All right. You still with me? It's a lot. So just briefly, and this is cellular function, and I know that you've gotten so much detailed medical information, but I think it's just, I want to share this, and I'll be brief about it, but this is kind of the little machinery of how our body really works. It's tiny, you can't see it, but it's there, and it's important. And so I'm going to briefly touch on mitochondrial function, methylation, and detoxification. So a mitochondria is a little part of the cell which we normally call the power plant of the cell. And I put a picture there, it's a neuron, and it's got a lot of these mitochondria because a neuron's a very complicated cell and it needs a lot of energy. And right, our kids are having problems in that area. And that's just a little blow up, and it shows you this fancy little reaction that happens that requires oxygen and water, and it makes our little energy molecule that's called ATP. I just put this up because, I don't know, before med school I thought all these drawings and everything were like cartoons, like maybe that's what's in there, but no, it's actually in there. And this is what a real mitochondria looks like. And there are things that can damage mitochondrial function. Medications can do it. And you have to be careful. Acetaminophen does have a negative effect on mitochondria, which is why I usually recommend ibuprofen rather than, acetaminophen. Chemicals, toxins, heavy metals, and infection. When you see, and I'm not talking about mitochondrial disease. That's a different entity, and that's usually, identified by profound symptoms that a child has at a young age. But I'm talking about what happens to our kids at a biochemical level when they become sick with an illness like this, and how can we get in there and help them in the healing process? When you see mitochondrial dysfunction, you often see fatigue, low tone, low weight, slow growth, and then impaired immune and neurologic function. So it needs to be supported if we can, and if we do support it, then that can help in our healing process. I only put this up to show that fats, carbohydrates, proteins are what go into this fancy little cycle that happens in the mitochondria to put our energy out. Again, just the concept of real food. Okay, this methylation's stressful. I tried to find a friendly molecule for you, but basically, it's a little carbon with 3 hydrogens attached to it, and there's one empty space. So this little molecule bounces around and it turns things on and off in the cell. And this is where a lot of what's called epigenetics it focuses on, and in many other areas. But basically, how do your genes work and how do they interact with the environment? And a process, this methylation's how we work, and some of our kids have problems with doing it efficiently. And that may not matter until you're sick. And maybe you wouldn't get as sick if your methylation was working properly. So methylation is dependent on vitamins, minerals, and proper nutrients. It's heavily dependent on the B vitamins, magnesium and zinc, and proper amounts of essential fatty acids, your omega-3, 6, and 9s. It produces this really cool substance in our body called glutathione, which is our body's natural antioxidant, and it really helps us regulate ourselves. And I don't know what the numbers are for PANS, I'll have to be honest, but there's a couple of papers that show that about 80% of children with autism have low glutathione levels. And one of the recent papers I read showed that curcumin actually increases blood glutathione levels, which may be part of the benefit that you see when people take it. Okay, this was just to see if everybody was awake. That is the methylation cycle. And I'm not going to go through this at all, but I did, if my pointer works, and my monovision lenses are working. So right here in the middle is where the process happens that is dependent on B12 and folic acid. And they're like little gears that turn. And this cycle over here is where your neurotransmitters get produced. And down at the bottom of the cycle is where your glutathione gets produced. And it uses energy. And that, all I wanted to show you was, it's complex. And everything depends on each other. And if you look throughout that diagram, the things that are circled are the necessary cofactors, and you see over and over again the B vitamins, zinc, and magnesium. When you do biochemical testing, you see that they're low in many of our children. It's such an easy thing to fix, so that's what I normally do. And detoxification, glutathione's involved in detoxification. It's basically how do we clean out all these things we're exposed to on a daily basis. It starts at the cellular level, then it goes through your GI system. So those are the systems we're trying to support. And I kind of already said this, but one of my big areas for detoxification is just try to not get exposed to the toxins if you can help it. You know, anything that goes on your skin, anything you're breathing, and anything you're eating. Try to make it as easy on your body as possible. There's tests I do to look at this, a regular metabolic profile, which is routine blood work and looking at your liver and kidneys. There's certain specialty tests I might use looking at urine metabolites, which can help me understand how those things are doing. There's a genetic test it's called a SNP. It's inexpensive and easy to get. And then based on concerns I may have, if I'm worried about methylation, or I'm worried about mitochondrial function, or I'm worried about maybe environmental exposure or heavy metal exposure, then I'll get some specialty testing that I listed there. And then the treatments are for mitochondria. And you can see, you'll see the same thing over and over again, fatty acids, B vitamins, and then a few other, and this is from Kennedy Krieger, who's done a lot of work with mitochondrial dysfunction in kids with autism, and they're very safe, very straightforward supports like coenzyme Q10, L-carnitine, vitamin E, and vitamin C that sometimes clinically, when you put a child on a cocktail like this, you can see their energy improve in a matter of weeks. And kiddos who haven't been growing or moving or gaining weight start doing all those things, and it's very rewarding when you see that happen. So, homeostasis revisited. I already gave you all the concepts, but health is the ability to return to a state of homeostasis. And that is what we are trying to accomplish for our children. And you did hear so many stories of hope today that our kids can and do get better. And this information, I hope, is information that will help you to feel empowered to do other things for your children that can help as you're waiting for them to get better. So I appreciate your attention, and I'll take any questions if we have, I think, maybe 5 minutes left.
Have you tried Bravo probiotics? Have you tried that yet?
No, with the GC-MAF? No, I haven't. Mm-mm.
I just started it with my son. My son has autism and PANDAS, or PANS. He's a lot of work.
Yes.
But we started doing that really recently, and I haven't seen any. I've always been very militantly gluten-free, casein-free, soy-free, because when I did that, my son's diarrhea went away. So, duh, I'm going to do that. But so I started doing this, even though it has I was worried to do it, and I tried it. I've seen no bad effects. We were on the trajectory better. We're getting better right now, and I wouldn't say that's the reason, but I just was curious because it has like 41 strains, and I didn't do probiotics before because I thought it was causing too much overgrowth of certain types. So that was one question. And then the other thing was, have you tried, and I haven't done this yet, but there's an autism one, I went to see that, there was a product called Biome Restoration where they're putting actually, it's like a parasitical type of treatment, and it's supposed to help with anxiety.
I have tried that, and I mentioned my mentor was Dr. Nancy O'Haron, and she and Sid Baker have been using that a lot and having a lot of success with it. And basically, it's like a probiotic, but instead of being a bacteria or a friendly yeast, it's actually a parasitic larva. That the human host is not a place where it can actually mature into a full parasite that would cause disease or infection. And actually, it has a complicated life process, but it used to be in living in the grain beetle. And back before we processed our food like we do now, we had big silos full of grain where the beetles were. And so we were exposed to this organism routinely. And it was part probably of most people's natural microbiome. And now they feel that it's gone. And through stool testing, they've determined it is gone. And for many kids who have a lot of anxiety, they'll do introduction of this organism every 3 to 4 weeks. And some individuals have a very nice response. But that's what I know about it. I've tried it.
People are using it for autism. I was curious if it works for like the anxiety that my son's not usually anxious, but with this whole PANS thing we've been having lately, that is our biggest issue. It's like destroyed everything. And so I just was wondering about if that would be help with anxiety. That was what I was trying to figure out with that.
I don't have a good answer because I haven't used it in any PANS patients.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, I'm over here. Over here.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, how is your daughter now? And also, are you taking new patients?
I am. My daughter's doing very well. She still has challenges, and of course, she has autism. She's wonderful, though. I mean, she's great. She's communicative. She was just a very, very sick little girl. I didn't know when she became ill. I didn't know any of what I just told you, and I didn't know anything about autism, to be honest with you. And in retrospect, she had an encephalitis episode that went undetected, by me and her pediatrician. And she had a lot to recover from. She was completely nonverbal. She opened and closed doors all day. Her only form of communication was biting me or hitting me in the face. She didn't sleep. She had foul diarrhea every day. She was just very, very sick. And you probably could tell from the picture with her dad, who she doesn't look anything like. I know she's mine because I carried her, but she's his clone. But she's doing great. She's in 4th grade. She's in a mainstream classroom with some support. She's got a great sense of humor. She has fun. She's wonderful. She's a joy. But she still has some OCD symptoms, but nothing at all like the debilitating symptoms she had before she had her IVIG.
Compared to everyone else, this was probably a very simple question. You talked about the ibuprofen and prefer to give the dye-free liquid as preferred. And even for kiddos that can swallow pills. But once they get to a certain age, their weight, I'd have to buy
it might not be practical.
Okay.
And if you get a prescription of of the 600 or 800 or 400 milligram tabs that are generic, they're not dyed. But some of my little kiddos, they get something with dye in it and they just go berserk. So, if you have the option, but it's reasonable to do a dye-free tablet. Yeah.
Hi, my son had restrictive eating off and on for years. It would occasionally get a little bit better, but because of that, I know that his gut really got messed up. When he does eat, or when he would eat, he would get severe constipation. I know you mentioned the bone broth. That's part of the GAPS diet. Have you had any success with the GAPS diet? Now, of course, if we see the restrictive eating, we'll give him whatever.
Sure.
He'll eat at the
Yes.
time. So
Yes, I have had a lot of success with the GAPS diet, and there's families here that I know have too. And it's such a low inflammatory, healing type diet for our kids that if you can do it, I do recommend it. And I didn't mention, just because of time, but in gut treatment, you know, constipation is so important to treat. I mean, you know, you just can't have that sitting in there. It makes our kids sicker. And so I also have a regimen I'll use, kind of a stepwise regimen. Try this. If it doesn't work, then add this, to really have a goal of 1 to 2 bowel movements a day. And it's achievable. You know, it's achievable. And as they start to have regular bowel movements on a regular basis, it's easier to get their gut back in balance. And, you know, you don't feel good when you're constipated for 6 or 7 days. You don't want to eat. I mean, there's other issues with the food restriction, but at least we can try to fix that part of it for them.
Do you see improvement with the GAPS diet even if they're not adhering to it 100%?
Yes. You know, and there's kind of a, well, I've heard it said many times, you know, 100% adherence, or, you know, 90% adherence doesn't get you 90% improved. It has to be 100%. You know, I guess theoretically that's true. And, you know, if you're trying to get the immune system to relax, then you really need to take it all the way out. But I would not have that discourage you from trying the best you can, because 70% of a great diet is way better than 0%. So I think you do what you can when you can, and you have your goals and you have reality, and just, you know, and I say this to patients all the time. When you're not moving in the right direction, you're in a state of panic. Time is working against you, and like we heard parents talk about when their children were so severely sick. But when you start moving in the right direction, time doesn't matter as much anymore. You know, you don't have to be in that same panic mode. So if you start going in the right direction, you just keep moving in that direction. It might not be as quickly as we all hope, but if we're going in the right direction, I feel like, you know, it's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. So you take it one day at a time, and then the accumulation of everything we've done hopefully ends up in a really happy, better place. Okay? We have no more oh, sorry.
Hi, do you think it's important to rotate probiotics? And then also, have you ever seen any of your PANS patients have a negative reaction to curcumin?
I know different providers do it different ways. I don't think it's important to rotate on a daily or weekly basis. I think maybe every 1 to 2 months you could choose a different formulation of different strains. So kind of when you're ready for a new bottle, do this one instead. I think it is very important. The colony forming units is how they dose it. And it is important to have an adequate level. And usually for maintenance it's 50 billion, and a lot of my kiddos are on about 100 billion. I have seen negative effects from curcumin, and that's one that I always start low and slow. And for some kids, I start with a sprinkle, and other, you know, and usually the routine regimen is a capsule, you know, and then increase it over 4 weeks to the gold dose. But curcumin does a lot, and sometimes it seems like a negative effect, but it's kind of like we were talking about with the SSRI medicines. It might just be too much at once. So if you use it and go up very slowly to a dose that's appropriate for that child, then often you can see the benefits without the negative effects. Usually when it's negative, it's too much too soon, because it has a lot of antimicrobial properties, you know.
The question I have refers to that exactly. Too many properties causing die-off. Can you give some good recommendations about how to handle herxing, whether you use charcoal, what you might recommend in terms of dosing and timing?
Yes. I have a handout that I made up for my patients called Natural Supports for Healing. And basically, some of the things you mentioned, you know, activated charcoal is really good. I also, I really focus on mineral support, and there's a variety of ways you can do it, and it's easy. But when you're going through a healing process like that, you don't want to be depleted of basic minerals, and, you know, our kids often are. I mentioned the Epsom salt baths, and then one of my big, I'm kind of recapping because I already said this, one of the big things I do for what people call, you know, herxing, which is a Jarisch Herxheim, I'm not going to say it right, but these two doctors who described it, when you kill a germ, it releases chemicals and also activates your immune system, and then you may feel worse. And it's temporary, but it can be severe, is to treat constipation. Many of the symptoms, if you just keep that bowel moving, will be drastically decreased. Thank you for your attention. All right, so I think our next speaker is Dr. Pollard. And welcome Dr. Pollard up.